let's open it up. Everyone has been listening and waiting patiently, and we can start in the room here if anyone has a question before going online. There's a question over here, to my right. And you might just introduce yourself, where you're from.
Good afternoon. Eric Conroy is my name, from Tashka. I've been listening a lot this morning about adaptation and against mitigation, which has been mentioned less. I'm just wondering, I'm just a bit skeptic about adaptation. If we don't resolve climate change by mitigation, adaptation won't be possible, and also things will change. The goalposts will move. Sea level rise is rising, so if we build walls and adapt for that, the sea levels will rise again. Things like food, there's more food resilient or climate resilient seeds. But as the temperature gets warmer, like in India, it just won't be possible. Should not all our efforts be into mitigation, stop climate change, and less on adaptation? If we've got a certain, just wonder about the debate between adaptation and mitigation. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that. And maybe I'll go to Rob, first of all, in Loughborough University. Mary Frances, you might like to come in on this as well. Rob, should we be focusing solely on mitigation?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I actually think we need to be doing both. We already have an adaptation deficit. Our cities' food, energy, water supply systems are already being impacted by climate change. So we already have to do something about ensuring the security of those systems in the face of current climate variability and change that has already happened. But I completely agree with the view that was expressed from the floor that these threats, these issues are going to compound through time. And I go back to my remark that we need to approach adaptation in an open-ended way. And that's why, as I was showing you in the case of the Thames Estuary Plan, there is no endpoint shown in terms of where the pathway goes. We just have to identify a sensible set of economically, environmentally, technically, and socially acceptable measures, and to figure out how best to bring them on stream in smart ways to manage the risk as it evolves. And we also need the monitoring systems in place to check the pace of climate change and its impact on the environment and the effectiveness of any interventions we make. So I think it's crucial that we take this open-ended and iterative approach, but we don't see it as an either or. We really have to press hard on both climate mitigation and adaptation and look for win-wins across the aisle, so to speak.
Does anyone else want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think it is important for us to focus on both. That if particularly just even in relation to the just transition, there are many communities in Ireland who are already being very much impacted by extreme weather events, by rising sea levels, and it's important that the connection is made to the experiences of climate change and the need for us to mitigate and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So I think by not making that connection, we're missing the purpose for why we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the first place. But definitely neither should be silenced in the conversation. Yeah.
Okay, was there another question here in the room? Okay.
Hi, Sean Hartigan, Green Party Councillor from Limerick. It was great to hear Padraig speak with such passion about just transition and embracing the biodiversity of the bogs in the Midlands. I'm from Limerick, and a lot of our sense of place is tied up in the River Shannon. With climate change, there's going to be significant impacts on the River Shannon with reduced flows. Fish species in the river are already significantly impacted by pollution, by illegal fishing, and particularly by barriers to migration at Partine and at Ardnacrusha. I want to ask Paddy Hayes, is the ESB going to embrace the biodiversity of the River Shannon and improve fish passage at Ardnacrusha Power Station and Partine Weir? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Sean, and nice to talk to you again. So this is quite a challenge for us. And as I said in my talk, we've 7 aspects of our strategy, and one of those is around very much stepping forward on environmental and sustainability and our social responsibility. So in Partine and on the Shannon, we put a huge amount of work into trying to make sure that particularly salmon and eels can make their way up and down the river, given the presence of the dam at Ardnacrusha. It's clear, and I think, Sean, you're aware of the work that we do there, but it's also clear that we can do more. And we welcome the challenge to do more. We are challenging ourselves to do more in relation to that. And we welcome the opportunity to work with you and the other interested parties around the Partine area to try and find ways of doing more. I think what Ardnacrusha does at the moment is it provides 100 megawatts of zero carbon electricity. It's interesting in a way, it's almost circular in a way that when I was speaking about we're trying to get down to zero carbon electricity for 2040, that actually in a way the state at a macro level started with zero carbon electricity back in 1927 from the Shannon. So it is an important resource, but I fully accept the challenge that we need to do more to get particularly eels and salmon and maybe other species as well safely up and down the Shannon and to improve the diversity overall. So challenge accepted.
Okay, let's have a talk to some people online and get some questions from Dervla.
Yeah, so I think that we have like 3 or 4 depending on time, but first off 2 sort of linked and shorter questions for Paddy Hayes here. So one of them is, can the carbon intensity of grid electricity feasibly go negative in the late 2030s?
Do you want maybe to give the second question as well? And
Yeah.
we can,
Okay. And then the other one is on when are significant incentives for microgeneration for individual householders going to come into play?
Paddy, I was trying to give you some time to think.
No, that's okay. So maybe go to the microgeneration one. First of all, the honest answer is I'm not sure about that. So that's a government policy. I should know the answer to it, but it's shortly. I know that a huge amount of work is being put into a microgeneration framework to try and ensure that there's not just support for domestic households to install microgeneration, but equally that people get value at times when they're offering the electricity back to the electricity system when they're not using themselves. I've got to say that from an ESP perspective, we think microgeneration is fantastic. There's we have a distribution system around the country, which is the kind of smaller wires that feed local areas and feed domestic houses. And one of the challenges, one of the things that I didn't mention earlier on in my talk was that between 2020 and 2040, we see a really significant increase in the demand for electricity. So at the same time as we're trying to decarbonize and build more renewables to decarbonize, we also see the use and the demand of electricity going up from, I think, roughly about 35 terawatt hours a year in 2022. Our models would show up around 50 terawatt hours in 2040. So there's a massive increase in the demand for electricity. And one of the things that microgeneration does is it allows in a local area more renewable electricity to be consumed without necessarily having to make a massive additional investment that has to be paid for by everybody in order to upgrade the distribution system. We think that data centricity and digital will be a real support in that. So I'm a real fan of microgeneration at that level of scale, kind of consistent with the sort of level of use that's happening in the local area. I don't exactly know when it's going to be a situation when domestic homeowners will be able to get compensate or get the value of the electricity they produce. But I think it is shortly, and I think the smart metering program is really going to support that, because when people have a smart meter in their house, which is going to allow them to interrogate that and understand what time of day their electricity is being produced, if they're got microgeneration, or being consumed, it's a real opportunity in relation to particularly decarbonisation of the system. So that's that. The answer is don't know, but I can see it happening shortly, and we really support it. It's a real big part of the significant part of the solution. Second question, in terms of negative, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I necessarily see that or even really understand the question. Maybe that question, maybe I'm missing something. So I don't know if there's anybody else.
Okay, well, are there more questions coming in online, Dervlan, just to bring in the other panelists?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So then one of the ones that would really apply to the whole panel would be on decreasing car journeys. The question coming in is remote working not a simple answer to this, as it means that we're not building more infrastructure. We already had max remote working during COVID, and the question asks, is the policy setting us backwards?
Robert, I might ask you to take that one.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate around the impact of remote working. There's a school of thought that because the journeys that are happening less frequently are longer, and maybe involving a different mode of transport. So if you lived in the west of Ireland and work in Dublin, and you're only one day a week in the office, then is that counteracting, maybe working closer to it? But I think it's a fair point, and most organisations have some form of hybrid working or remote working policy anyway, so it's a reality. And it's as much about quality of life as well, and about offering incentives to employees. I mean, it's quite hard to hold on to staff, I know of myself at the moment, and to attract staff. So it's all of those things coming in together. But, it isn't going to be just the working from home that's going to do that. And, if anybody's been looking at the data, Google Community produces data on a regular basis during COVID, and it shows that the pattern of movement has changed. So there's an awful lot more movement happening in residential areas, a lot of people going around to schools and to shops and that kind of area, and the longer journeys are changing. And what's also interesting in terms of public transport, the patterns have really flipped. The peak time is now at the weekends, Saturdays and Sundays, and not during the weekdays, the normal commuting time. So there's a lot happening in there, but it also presents a major opportunity. Upheaval does, and a little bit of chaos, so people start to reflect on what they're doing, so they may be looking at alternatives. And if you just factor in things like, the major government policy shift on the cost of public transport, that's going to have a dramatic impact wherever that's been implemented in other jurisdictions. So the way I would see modal shift, it's like pulling a number of different levers, and you have to pull all of them possibly at the same time. It's cost, it's safety in terms of active travel infrastructure, it's reducing the times. I mean, if there was one simple action that we could do right now in Dublin, and if any of you are getting the 46A home to Dunleary, would be to make sure that the bus lane is free all the way out, and that no cars get into it. The QBCs are arguably the most successful piece of sustainable transport infrastructure, so that's quality bus corridors from the early 2000s. And that reduced journey time by 10 minutes and increased bus usage by about 240%. So sometimes we get distracted by the big infrastructure projects, when really if we distill it down, there are actually things we could do now with a very good public transport system, and just rejigging that space to make sure it suits the sustainable modes and it's geared towards them.
And it always comes back to, it's just a multiplicity of things that are going to work with transport. There isn't, well, in any of this, there isn't going to be one solution, but particularly on the transport side. I might see, is there a question here, and hopefully for Padraig, because I think he's feeling left out. So I think
no panic, Bob.
Hi, I actually was going to say to Padraig, I think you did an amazing job of getting the lived experience across of climate justice and the injustices which often precede the issues which we're now facing. I think my question is kind of for the panel broadly. maybe particularly for Padraig and Robert. There was a lot of talk on decoupling earlier. Personally, I'd have a lot of concerns as to how that would play out in the spatialities of it, because I think when you align that with also the need for communities to have a sense of ownership and identity, when you bring in questions of power relations and who decides the changes that are happening, how can we feasibly align those two objectives, you know? And maybe just, you'd mentioned, Robert, about how current consultation processes weren't necessarily fit for purpose. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a bit further on what steps you think need to be taken to get to a point where we can have the public involved in a much more kind of decisive manner as opposed to just consultation. Thanks.
Do you want to go ahead, Padraig?
Yeah, okay. My own background is community development, and I suppose to give you a current answer, when we were dealing with the first fallout was the Board of Mona workers whose jobs were threatened by the transition. And we, when I say we, it was ourselves, the local authority, and the Department of Social Protection, and the local development company. We went to every Board of Mona works in the region, and we did a training needs analysis and a skills audit with each board. Now, no one was forced in the door, but we were there to do it. And I think if you're talking about consultation, that's what you're talking about. It's not that we're going to be in the library between 11 o'clock and 2:30, and if you make it, great, and if you don't. And by the way, when we go into the library, we have a plan that's 3/4 way developed, and you can put a little tick there to agree with it, and next there, and make that a bit lighter than the tick, if you don't mind. So I do think that if it's going to be consultation, it has to be real. And I think in fairness to Rob, I think that's what Rob is referring to, because you need people in from the beginning. Now, COVID has been used as a mighty excuse for not doing that. But I think we're in a position now, and I would say there has been a change. We've learned, the learning curve for us has been the National Just Transition Fund, which was a little bit difficult because of COVID, in fairness to everyone. But I think there is a much greater participation and sectoral participation in the European, in the territorial plan. And I do think we're learning from that. I think people are being more involved. But consultation must be real. Robert, sorry, no, I don't want to take.
And then we'll take one final question then, if you want to just answer the last piece of that question.
Yeah, in terms of it, I mean, it's the word itself, and sometimes that word has now been devalued to a sense, because do people see engagement as being better than consultation? It's a bit of semantics, really. But my point around it was that sometimes our public projects are quite set piece. Here's the thing, pretty much fully formed, tell me what you think. And then the thing that was more or less suggested gets built, and so you're wondering, did my contribution get included? I'm not being unfair to public bodies who are doing this. Sometimes that's what comes across, and that breeds into public trust or mistrust, perhaps. You know, are they serious about engaging with me? And that's what members of the public might ask. I think the approach that we took during COVID even was we would go out to the people. We would say, look, this is what we're planning to do. We might be doing it today, tomorrow. What do you think? We're going to try this here. Is that working for you? If not, we did work around driveways, for example, and curbs, and we adjusted the curbs 2 days later because it didn't work for them. It's that kind of real engagement that happens, and people say, okay, they're listening to me. And the discussion isn't necessarily, will the project happen? It's how will it happen? Because that's really where you want to get to, because we spend so much time talking about will it happen, and it goes on for months and years, but we don't actually get to it on the ground. And just one point on the public consultation, our public view, and you alluded to it. My own experience on the ground is that as projects and initiatives become much more specific and much more local, resistance increases. Because what we are seeing is that in the abstract and in generic, people support things like climate change, improved air quality, all of that. When you get down to the detail and saying, how is this impacting my life? Am I going to be inconvenienced? Will my journey be longer? Is that new building going to be beside me? You know, are those wind turbines? So I think that's a very important point. And this is backed up by research. So the CSO do a household quarterly survey on environmental concerns, and it showed that support for climate change and improved air quality is around 70%. But when they asked people, do they support urban traffic restrictions, that was at 29%. When they asked them, did they support restrictions on the use or on residential heating, which would be the type of fuels, that was at 7%. So you can see that disconnect. Everybody's for change, but they're not really sure if they want to change.
Okay, well let's take one final question. I know there are. I've gone this way. Sorry, but maybe engage afterwards. Yeah, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Hi, I just wanted to say to Padraig, for starters, thank you so much for your speech, because I'm from the Edenderry Moy Valley area and it rang very, very true to me. And I kind of wanted to talk to you and touch on the points that Conor made earlier about people's connection to their community and sense of space. And I find in my own area, a lot of it has been decimated by out-migration, particularly of young people. And it's just, when we think about these just transition projects and these local communities, it's just what is the plan of action for fighting for communities where there's really nobody left there to fight? That would be my question.
Yeah, I think, look, it's challenging. And I'm not going to come and make any platitudes to anyone who's involved in a rural community where outward migration is probably, and look, I'm from Ferban, where there's a huge issue around our demographics, where we have probably one of the highest old age dependency ratios in the country. And we're absolutely absent of the cohort that is producing income to keep a local economy going, producing children to keep schools open. So we have an issue. Now, I think we can do two things about it. We can fall over and say, look, we're gone, forget about it. But last one out, turn off the lights. If Paddy hasn't them turned off before they get turned off, before we get the chance. But we are a resilient people. And I think there is pre-development work, and ironically, I think we understood just how deeply embedded Boland and the ESB were in our communities. And I think because they were so good employers, such good employers as semi-state companies, we probably are a little bit lacking in community development, a little bit behind other parts of the country. So there's pre-development work to be done with people. There's a whole sense of place and sense of pride in place that needs to be rediscovered for our communities. And that requires a bit of time. And look, I don't want, because we've been talking all day, and I heard the first thing on the radio this morning, I heard about how urgent this is. But transitions of the nature you're talking about, the more successful transition in Europe to date is the Ruhr Valley in Germany, because it had that twin approach that I was talking about. But it's 30 years in existence. So we're not going to do it in 5 years or 2 years or 5 months or 5 weeks in West Offaly or in North Longford. So I think we have to give it a time, but we have to get on that journey. And it's a journey that is well worth taking and to regenerate. And I do think things like remote working have a role to play from the other perspective, from the community's perspective, so that people can live locally in safe, secure environments where their health and well-being is well catered for, but also work for a company that is locationless and be living in Edenderry and working for some crowd that's based in America or based nowhere. So I think there's a whole lot of things come together. It is multifaceted, and there is a multiplicity of answers to it. It's going to take time, but whatever else we do, we can't give up hope. That's the one thing we can't lose.
That does seem like a good point on which to draw the session to a close, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sharon Finnegan, who will close the conference. But just first of all, to give a round of applause for our panel, to say thank you from my perspective.